two of the people I'm going to be introducing is somebody who is extremely accomplished in his or her field, and that was sort of the price of being invited to be on the podium. But I realized that each of them are also people who've taken real chances in their lives and who are originals. As far as I know, there's nobody like them. And Danielle Allen certainly fills those bills. She's intellectually fearless. She goes where the questions and issues of the day call for her wits. And so, speaking today on good citizenship, I have a little phrase for each of our speakers. This is my one for Danielle, who I've gotten to know personally because we worked together, a number of projects together. Across the disciplinary terrain, she unites thought, language, and action in exemplary fashion. Danielle.
So I am going to launch our conversations today with a discussion about good citizenship. I'm a believer in collective intelligence, the idea that group brains are better than any given individual brain. And so my intention today is to ask all of you to help me think about some of the things that I'm finding particularly difficult to think about in the contemporary context with regard to the issue of how to prepare young people for effective and satisfying lives as citizens. Howard introduced things with the reading of the first few sentences of Tale of Two Cities. He talked about spring of hope and winter of despair. And there's a sense in which actually my talk is going to focus on exactly that opposition or contrast. The opposition between the incredible capacities, potential opportunities that are available to young people now and the simultaneous pressures and intensities that puts on them in ways that can in fact incapacitate, destroy their ability for action and so forth. So let me start with just an overview of a very simple framework for thinking about citizenship, one that I find helpful. In general, one needs to think about three things. How is it that young people acquire a sense of agency in the first place? To be a citizen, one needs to have a sense of ownership over one's world, a sense of having the capacity to be a co-creator, to help make that which one lives in. Then, of course, one needs an ethics or citizenship. Once one is empowered to act, what is the right way to act? How does one do well as a citizen? I think in all of our fields, we spend a lot of time thinking about those first two things, how to inspire efficacy in young people, how to give them ethical parameters for action. Then there's a third thing that I find myself less good at thinking about, and this is where I'm going to ask for your help today. And that's got to do with understanding the meaning of action. So one can be empowered to act, one can have an ethical framework for acting, but what then are the consequences of action? What does it mean actually to live as an actor? How do the effects of action rebound back on us? There are incredibly complicated further ethical dilemmas and also psychological dilemmas that reside in this territory of understanding what it means to be an actor who's made something happen in the world, the effects of which will provoke reactions that will redound back on us. Citizens act in a public sphere. The original public sphere was in Athens, the center of a hill near the marketplace of Agora in Athens, near the Acropolis with Nick, so that's just a picture of it there. It's a single space. And people, when they began thinking about politics and about what good citizenship is, very often thought in terms of the spaces in which one would act as a citizen. So the marketplace, the forum, the assembly. For those spaces, they developed elaborate accounts of the ethics to guide people in acting in them. And I just wanted to point to this so that if you want to talk about it in the conversation, we can. But among the ethical points that they focused on were the notion that people had to learn how to fight fair. So it's okay to be a fighter, to be an advocate, but you had to have, in some sense, a notion of good sportsmanship as part of that. Another thing I spent time doing was deliberating, making decisions for collective communities. That activity of deliberating required an ethical stance of disinterestedness, an ability to rise above one's own position and think about the collective good of the whole. The third thing that they focused on, what I've given a contemporary formulation for, something I call just culture jamming. Culture jamming is what lots of young people now use as a label to refer to the effort to change the symbols a culture uses to understand itself, to change important value terms and so forth. How do you do that justly? How do you engage with the things people care most about in terms of their civil worlds and so forth justly and fairly? That was another of the ethical questions that people thought about in antiquity in the context of understanding good citizenly action in those limited spaces. We all live in particular communities of expression, small communities, where with our friends we form our identities, we decide what we care about, we reflect on our values. In our contemporary world, however, anything that we do in that context can easily trip over into much larger context, whether we want it to or not. That's a fundamental difference from previous eras, where it was possible to maintain genuine separations between what we all do in small spaces and what might flow out into larger spaces. So the question really is how to help people think about how to help young people think about a world in which what they do in the smallest of spaces may have ramifications in much bigger, different spaces. Can the virtue of moderation help for us in the same way that it helped for people in antiquity? I'm not sure about that. So what I'd like to do is to suggest a few other concepts or ideas that might help think about the boundlessness of action, help people reflect on how to prepare for that experience, an experience that at some level neither Jason nor Aaron was prepared for. I'd like to suggest that the way we think of citizenship and experience it now should focus our attention on exactly this issue of the boundlessness of action. The fact that there are many chains of consequences that flow from what we choose to do, and it's extremely difficult to anticipate them all in the beginning. How much more boundless, then, is action and its stream of consequences in the contemporary world, where nobody's community is limited to a number like 200,000, where everybody's community is ultimately, possibly, a global community. And we talk a lot about global citizenship. I'm sorry. And as we've done that, I think we are beginning to cultivate in young people a genuine sense of global responsibility. A sense that choices made here, for example, of what to drive or what to consume, affect choices there in another part of the world with regard to economic possibilities for other people, with regard to climate change and environmental devastation in other parts of the world. With that sense of global responsibility, we are also actually cultivating in young people an ability to think about modes of global efficacy. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. Many people operate in small spaces and small groups, but at the same time that that's the case, the most dramatic examples of citizenship that we seem to have these days in our contemporary world do play out on a global scale. So as I said, I'll come to those examples in just a moment. But then that leads, we have a sense of global responsibility and a real potential for global efficacy to an even vaster sense of the boundlessness of action. But what am I not responsible? How do I possibly draw limits on what I should be doing? So what I want to do then today is focus on two very dramatic cases of young people who have taken on that sense of global responsibility and acted on it and achieved global efficacy, but who have suffered tragic consequences in one case, and certainly very negative consequences in another case. The two cases I want to take up are Jason Russell, who's executive director of something called Invisible Children, which launched a campaign you may have heard of, Pony 2012, last year. I'll come back and tell you more about what that is in just a moment. And the other case is Aaron Swartz, who was an incredible technologist, who's co-inventor of our SSS feed, did many other things, but then violated the law in pursuit of open access commitments, was subjected to a very serious felony indictment and killed himself in January after 2 years of living under the pressures of that criminal process. So if we go back to the stories of Jason and Aaron, what are the things that they and their friends said about what they might have done differently and better in their own particular situations? First of all, Jason himself said that he didn't rely enough on other people, that he tried to take too much responsibility into himself. He thought of action in too individualized a model. He didn't, in that regard, take seriously the idea of what it means to do things as a team or as a community. And retrospectively, he thinks he would have been better off if he'd been able to do that. To think not about himself as an actor, but to think about communities as actors. So that's one idea that has emerged from these two stories as I've tried to sort through what happened with them. Another issue is this question of accepting finitude, accepting limits. We can recognize a real kind of global responsibility. But what are the limits to that in terms of what any individual can or should feel? What are the limits to that in terms of what we should plan as our own sphere of action within that very broadly expansive sense of responsibility? Both Jason and Erin, in various ways, had questions about that, but didn't have answers to that. A third issue, and this relates to what I was trying to say about the notion that a voice now can travel in ways that are previously unexperienced by humanity. How does one come to anticipate unanticipated audiences? So both Jason and Erin were utterly surprised by the kind of reactions that redounded to their action. Okay? Jason did not expect the kind of volume of response that they got. He did not expect the direct threats to himself personally that he got from his action. So the issue of cyberbullying is partly relevant here. Erin did not expect the magnitude of the prosecutorial response from the government in relationship to his action. And how can one anticipate unanticipated audiences? It's the point of unanticipated audiences that you can't anticipate them. So, of course, that's exactly right. How then does one prepare for the notion that the reactions to one's actions will have a multitude of surprises? How does one help people think about that, prepare for that? And then, lastly, another idea that comes out in listening to the reactions of friends and family to both the Jason story and the Erin story is that they each needed more of something that we might call an agency-preserving self-discipline. And I don't mean this in a critical way with regard to either of them. But the notion is that somehow or another they just weren't protected enough of their own selves, of their being. And that their failure to protect their own being, their own existence, had to do with their not having enough understanding, really, of the kind of day-to-day discipline required to do that. The day-to-day discipline involved in stepping back from something or reaching out for help to other people and so forth. I think many of you know a lot more about that kind of agency-preserving discipline than I do, but that seems to be another critical part of thinking about how to help young people who are struggling, simply here, with the boundlessness of action in our contemporary world.
The support system or the team that helps the individual should be a diverse team. Because if you have a group of people who think the same as you, they might be as shocked as you are with the response. Mm-hmm. And this is what we try to do at our school, is to have kids think differently and to surround themselves with people who are different from them, so that if they are taking an action, there's a better chance that all these unanticipated events, someone in the group has to kind of know better how to handle that, and it's much more effective than when you just have a very homogeneous group.
Mm-hmm.
Educators struggle with the idea of boundlessness, and we're talking about kids needing to be prepared for the response, but I think the onus is on us to understand how the notion of communication has changed, and that kids, by and large, communicate very differently than what we're used to. And so I think if we're going to ask kids to be prepared, we need to be prepared and really study what that means.
I think we do a disservice to young people. I'm a history teacher and a philosophy teacher, but I think we do a disservice to them when we focus too much on heroes and individual actors within historical narrative rather than, as you were saying, talking about collective action and so on. And I think all young people, as they're growing up, they are struggling with that sense of themselves And from childhood through to adulthood, part of that process is trying to help them to develop a sense of humility, I think. So I think that's a crucial aspect of this.
So, I mean, you're certainly right that, I have a sense of the distinction between my own opinions and those of others, and my opinions are in some sense earned, so I feel capable of defending them, and I also feel capable of drawing boundaries with regard to what is a legitimate criticism and what I should just, water off the duck's back, sort of thing. And although I can give content to what I've learned, I find that I can't give a biographical account of how I learned it, which then leaves me without resources to explain how one would accelerate the teaching of that, because I'm sure I have learned it over 20 years, not over a period of 4 years. So how does one open up that learning that adults who have achieved some sort of relatively significant scope of action such that they really have to deal with actions or doubting effects? How does one open up that kind of biographical experience and learning and turn it into something that can be repackaged as a curriculum and with supported by pedagogy and to give it to people faster? So that's the question I'm struggling with. I said I believe in collective intelligence. So what I hope maybe to have done is to have sketched out a problem and provided some preliminary thoughts for thinking about it. But what I would really love would be to hear from you about how to how best help young people think about this issue that I've named as the boundlessness of action. Thank you for your attention.
How to connect political philosophy with the schools? Because what's citizenship, I think, is a big question that we can think on it from a maximalist point of view and minimalist point of view. I would say here we are looking for the maximalist point of view that could be, in my opinion, the best for education.
One is to get kids to work to see beyond their own nose a little bit and see that there's a wider world out there with real concerns and real action that they could take that would be beneficial to folks that they don't even know. And at the same time, I think in listening to some of her examples, both from literature and also real, is there has to be built into that some notion of perseverance.
I think it's important to teach the idea of community, and it's hard to do that because heroes are exciting and individuals create this direct place to look and to go, but most change happens because of people working together, and finding a way to make that exciting for young people is something that I think I will think about.